Welcome to Green Time. I'm host Don Fitz. This episode we're going to hear Marti Crouch talk about weeds. In May 2004 at Midwest Biodevastation 8, Marti Crouch was the keynote speaker. She talked about the changes in modern agriculture and especially the importance that traditional agriculture has for their weedy relatives, how weeds can actually help feed people, how weeds can help keep predatory insects out, how weeds can help stabilize the whole agricultural situation. And let's take a look at the video, Let There Be Weeds.
Good morning. I want to thank the Gateway Greens for inviting me to speak here today. It's nice to be back in St. Louis in the spring. You have so many beautiful trees and flowers here. Also, I just want to comment a little bit on the nice introduction from Digger. I feel a little bit embarrassed to be riding on credentials from so long ago for expertise to talk about genetic engineering. I closed my lab in 1990 and have kept up with some of the literature occasionally, particularly I study up when I have to give a talk. But mainly I've become more of a philosopher and perhaps what you might call an agricultural theologian. I think mainly about the relationship of people and agriculture with other organisms in nature. And although it helps to be able to think broadly from experience and having run a lab and done gene cloning and so forth, I have a tactile sense of what the technology entails. I hope that whether you agree with me or not, or how provocative my analyses are based on how much sense they make to you more than my particular training, and that in fact you'll listen from wide sources whether or not people have direct experience with the technology. I don't know if that's a disclaimer or not here at the beginning. What I want to talk about today, 45 minutes, an hour isn't long enough to really go into lots of details on technical issues, but I'd like to set up 3 different technologies that are being used in agriculture today and talk about how I analyze those technologies for their effects on health and the environment, to give a template for how I think about how these things impact our lives. I think of human health and the environment as being inseparable. It's impossible for me to think of being healthy in a degraded world. When the water is polluted, when air has all kinds of toxins in it, where people don't have a relationship with nature, where they're nurtured by the other species, these are preconditions for disease, in my opinion. And so I don't separate the effects of a technology on health and the environment. I think of them as basically being the same. And I'm going to start with just a little story. Genetic engineering, I'll call it genetic engineering, although genetic modification or biotechnology is a more general term are perfectly fine with me. I'm going to call it engineering because the people who are involved in changing the DNA of organisms by inserting genes think of the organisms as machines with interchangeable parts. And they're going to take a part from one species and modify it in a test tube and by growing it through various bacteria so that it will have characteristics that they've designed into it. And it's that intention, the idea that we have a plan for the corn or the soybean or the salmon. We have a plan for what we want them to do. We have a blueprint. That is the engineering attitude. Now, whether it's successful or not, whether the organisms that are being engineered will act like machines or will act like little factories depends on how closely the machine model fits life. I don't think it fits very well. The organisms are not just machines, although you can think of certain parts of them in mechanistic ways. And so the engineering exercise runs into problems pretty fast when it encounters organisms with their own agendas and their own paths through lives. But it's that attitude of engineering that I like about the term genetic engineering, that we are attempting to tailor organisms to be tools for us or to be parts of our factories and industries. So genetic engineering, the ability to be able to modify genes from any organism and move them between species, is a radical technology. Although we may have wished to do engineering with organisms in the past and may have tried to do it in various ways, the limits of the species being able to mate and the variability within their own heritage made it difficult for us to do it the way we dreamed. And so it's radical in the sense that it allows great leaps between organisms that have been separated by sometimes billions of years in the terms of bacteria and animals and plants that rarely occurred in nature. But it's conservative in the sense that the context, the worldview, the way of thinking about agriculture and nature is still the same. So we're taking a radical technology and putting it in the context of our capitalistic, industrial, mechanistic worldview. And I think that's a dangerous combination. Starting with the Roundup Ready soybeans. I'm going to say that the first thing we should be doing as critics of biotechnology is talking about the intended application. What happens if this technology is successful? And then, at the same time, since organisms don't seem to be very good machines, and they're trying to force them into a machine model, we should talk about, okay, if this technology is adopted, what are the unintended consequences? How is this going to be unpredictable, and what kinds of effects are that going to have on health and the environment? You with me? Okay, Roundup Ready soybeans. I love weeds. I have to admit that right here at the beginning. I'm talking about weeds as the plants that grow without human intention in disturbed soil, such as agricultural landscapes, waste places, railroad right-of-ways, that sort of thing. Not the invasive plants that can go in and destroy a forest like some of the honeysuckles or kudzu vine. I'm talking about the classic agricultural weeds. But we live in a culture that is at war with any organism, weeds, pests of various kinds, nematodes, that inhabit our agricultural landscape. There is an ethic of cleanliness being next to godliness, and cleanliness being defined in an agricultural sense, a clean field, and you'll see advertisements for how clean is your field, as one that only has the intended crop. So 1,000 acres of the variety of corn that you've planted and nothing else in there, or soybeans. This is the classic definition of a monoculture. And historically, how we got to that point is complex and interesting and involves corporate control over the seed supply and all kinds of political aspects of agriculture and so forth. But it also has to do with a philosophical orientation that we have that culture and nature should be separate. And that agriculture, as part of our culture, there should be a wall between agriculture and nature.